I feel so humbled to be here with you guys. I was thinking about it this morning and wondering why I was so intimidated by this crowd. And the reason is because I've met a lot of you, and I've seen what you've done with your life so far. And then I met a lot of BYU alum, and I've seen what they've done with their life afterward. And I think you're going to do amazing things. And I'm excited to talk to you about this. I think it might be useful just to start by talking to you about kind of a little bit of background on my career and how my career's gone. So you can see BYU, MIT, McKinsey, Polaris. Now let me tell you the real story. There you go. All right. So, redneck kid from Gallup, New Mexico, heart of the Indian country right in between three reservations. Start working, age 8, cleaning video game screens. Worked through high school, putting mobile homes out on the reservation, selling pickup campers to anybody I can find who will buy a pickup camper. Make one linear decision in my whole career. And that one linear decision was a rifle shot to go to BYU. I said, that is the place I want to go. I only applied one place, went to BYU. Went to BYU, started out in mechanical engineering, realized that I had more passion for manufacturing, went over into manufacturing, thought I was going to stay and do the IPD program, and then had a buddy who applied to MIT, and I'm like, hey, if you can get in, I might as well try it. So I tried, applied to MIT, shamelessly rejected the MIT, didn't get in. And that's like March or so. And in August, I get a call from a professor at MIT who says, hey, want to come to MIT? To which I said, yes, I do want to go to MIT. And so take a big curveball, go to MIT, get there, get about a year and a half in, and am convinced that this redneck from New Mexico, first of all, had no place at MIT, and second, had no chance of getting a job. So just kind of quit going to class for a month or so, almost flunked out while I was interviewing for jobs, and got a bunch of great opportunities, turned them all down, and decided to stay on and do an MBA. Stayed on, did an MBA. During the MBA, realized that I kind of might want a PhD, decided, stayed on, did a PhD. Then I thought I was going to be a professor, convinced that I was going to be a professor, and I meet this company called McKinsey and Company, consulting firm. And I wasn't actually interested in consulting at the time. And they call and they're like, hey, just come and try. Just come meet us and talk to us about your job. And the way that they did it is they did this wicked, they kind of lull you in and they tell you that the test is going to be easy, but it's written by the College Board. And you get there and it is a wicked hard test. And I sat there through that test, and my mind that night was faster than it's ever been before and faster than it's ever been since. And I was like, hey, if I'm really feeling that way, I got to try this. So end up going toward McKinsey. They offered 5 different locations we could go to. We decided kind of randomly to go to Cleveland. Went to Cleveland, stayed there for 9 years. You can see there were a bunch of opportunities that came up. Saudi Arabia, just a variety of opportunities that came up there. Didn't go down that path. And stayed at McKinsey. My dad, my parents live in southern Colorado. My dad got Parkinson's, and so we decided we'd go to Denver, and went to Denver. And I remember talking to the managing director of McKinsey, saying, "Hey, I'm going to go to Denver." And he's like, "Well, what are you going to do in Denver?" And I said, "How about I start an office?" And he said, "All right, let's try that." So I went there, unbelievably fulfilling experience, but spent 5 years in Denver. I was there for 4 years. Family was there for 5. And then I get a call from the CEO of Polaris who says, hey, any interest in coming and doing this job at Polaris? And I was a big rider this whole time. What I forgot to tell you is in New Mexico, if I wasn't working selling pickup toppers or mobile homes, I was riding 3-wheelers, Honda ATV 3-wheelers, Yamaha ATV 3-wheelers. I just loved them. And I was kind of born into it and then kept going. And when the CEO of Polaris calls, you think, boy, that'd be a pretty fun job. And eventually, I left my wonderful job at McKinsey, went to Polaris, and now I'm 2 years in Polaris Off-Road. So as you can see, there have been kind of a series of decisions that I've made, and every career looks kind of like this. And it's very, very, very rare that it's just going to be purely linear. It's a series of decisions. I think most people have kind of 8 to 10 decisions that they'll make over the course of their career. And those decisions, ultimately a BYU student's going to make those decisions with a lot of help from Heavenly Father. But if you think about Doctrine and Covenants 9, where the Lord says, study it out in your mind and then ask me if it's right. I want to talk to you guys today about how to study it out in your mind, some dimensions that I think you ought to be thinking about as you think about your career. So I want to start out with a couple of questions, right? And what I'd like is if everybody get out their phone and send themselves a text of that question. Who owns my career? Turns out on this one, there's a single unique answer. And there's one right answer. So just take a second, type it in, put your answer in. And then type this second one. What do I want from my career? This one's a little more complicated. So I saw a professor, Christian J. Hammond, who's a professor of artificial intelligence at Northwestern. He gave a talk the other day. And he gave me this little parable, or this example, that I thought was really interesting. And I call it Hammond's Apple Dilemma. And so here's Hammond's Apple Dilemma. He says, he had a friend who had an extraordinary capability at apple arbitrage. So what I mean by apple arbitrage is he starts out in the morning with one apple. By the end of the evening, he'll have 2 apples. And if he starts out with 2, he'll end up with 4. If he starts out with 128, he'll end up with 256. And he comes to you and he says, hey, would you be willing to invest in Apple with me? And if you do, I'll give you half of the apples that I earn over the course of the next couple months. So here's the dilemma. Here's the question I have for you. Would you rather be paid, and you're engineering students, I mean, you're going to understand this one well, right? Would you rather be paid daily, or would you rather be paid weekly over the course of those 2 months? How many would rather be paid daily? All right, a few of you. How many would rather be paid weekly? All right, most of you. Well, most of you are right, because if you're paid daily, you're going to get 40 apples. If you're paid weekly, you'll get 4.6 billion apples, right? And so if you are a money-grubbing profiteer, 4.6 billion apples, that's the way you're going to go, right? I mean, you want to make that investment and you want to get that earnings. But what if you're hungry? What if you don't have any food? Then how do you want to be paid? Or what if you look at it and you say, look, what am I going to do with 4.6 billion apples? 4.6 billion apples takes a lot of room, right? I don't have any distribution. I don't have any way to sell 4.6 billion apples. And by the way, if I were to have a great big warehouse that would fit 4.6 billion apples, first of all, it'd be a pretty big warehouse. And I'm not sure I could get it built fast enough, but if I did, I have to store it under nitrogen, and it's a horrible thing to do because everybody dies because they walk in and they don't realize what's going on. And if I think about it even more, there's all these people, I mean, how am I ever going to eat 4.6 billion apples, right? Because there's a bunch of people in Africa that don't have anything, and I can't even get it over to them, and so why would I agglomerate 4.6 billion apples? Because the Friends' capability was not in growing 4.6 apples, it was in accumulating 4.6 billion apples. And so the point is, in almost every decision, it really depends on what you're trying to accomplish. What are you trying to get out of the decision? And so here's how I think about the decisions that you'll make on your career. Again, remember, you're going to lean on the Lord's going to guide you, but there's about 6 things that I think you got to think about as you make career decisions. And I thought it might be interesting for you to hear from me on them. Because it turns out in my career, like for whatever reason, I don't know, I mean, I look at doctors, and doctors have thousands of discussions with people about health. I look at stake presidents, they have thousands of discussions with people about their spiritual health. For whatever reason, I have had thousands and thousands of discussions with people about their career. And people always want to talk about their career, and so here's kind of what I want to talk about. So you can see up there's the 6 dimensions, right? Money, passion, impact, time, personal growth. And then one I couldn't come up with a name for, and so I just call it the X factor. But let me just talk you through each one of these things. I'm going to start out with money. So here's the thing with money. If I ever want to attract somebody to Polaris or to McKinsey or wherever, the easiest way in the world is to offer them more money than they're making now. And the reason for that is because people recognize that they work for money, and money is one of the most direct things that we get from work. And also, I think people equate money and how much money they're making with their overall success. And I think they also equate it with their, I'm going to move this over so that as I turn my head, it doesn't keep going away. So. They also equate it with their happiness. And so I think they over-rotate on money. Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, money's required. You need it. By the sweat of our brow shall we eat. We know that. So it's important, but I think people over-rotate on it. So I made this little chart for you. I call it my money chart. So at McKinsey, we'd say, McKinsey, we produce pages for a living. And in most documents, there'd be a couple charts. It would be like the money chart. These are the charts that really make the difference. Here's my money chart. So on the y-axis there, you've got happiness, and then you've got kind of the counter to happiness, which is financial stress and misery. On the x-axis, you have the amount of money that you've made. Anybody have any ideas on what the curve is going to look like? What the relationship is going to look like? All right, take a look. Here's what I think it looks like. So I had a bishop that I talked to, and I was telling him, I said, hey, money doesn't make you happy. And he said, oh, but it'll sure make you miserable. And he's exactly right. When I was in Boston, they called me to be a ward employment coordinator. And it was 2003, just as we were coming into a recession in the tech industry in Boston. So we had a bunch of people lose their job in my ward. I couldn't believe it. I mean, I had a lot of grown men break down and cry. And I just watched them just feel completely despondent, unable to think about anything else. The only time I've ever seen anything like it is when people have somebody very sick in their family or when somebody passes away. They were absolutely miserable because they felt like they had failed, but more importantly, they felt like they couldn't provide for their family and they weren't meeting their obligations, right? And it's a horrible feeling, right? And it's misery. But as they got jobs and as they dug out of it, I kind of watched and I'm like, hey, does it make them happy? Does it give them joy? And it turned out they got to the absence of misery over financial stress, but they still weren't happy. And so here's the rest of the curve right here. There's a point that I call the point of security. So this is the point at which you can meet your obligations. You can, you can do some saving, you can do some fun stuff, but you're not really that worried about money. Now, you're still probably planning around money. You're still, your life is, you're planning around money as you think about it. But, it's the point at which it's not the only thing you're worried about. And beyond that, more money gives you a couple things. The first thing is luxury. And when I say luxury, I mean instead of a Honda Accord, you're going to get a BMW, right? Instead of a BMW, you're going to get a Porsche, right? And it just keeps compounding. And by the way, I like sports cars, and so we'll just put that disclaimer out there that as I have made more money, I tend to buy sports cars, right? And it's something. And the interesting thing about it is it's fun, but it doesn't make me happy. It's just fun, right? And then there's an opportunity to have philanthropy, and that's fulfilling for a moment. But recognize that line is flat. There's all these other things in your life that'll make you happy, that'll give you lasting joy, but money is not one of them. Now here's the other thing. This point of security, it's about this wide, depending on the commitments that you've made. So the commitments usually that we talk about are debt, but there's lots of other ways that we can get in commitments. So, you watch the subscriptions, if we added up all the subscriptions at our house for all the cable and for Hulu and Netflix and I don't know all these things. Deseret Book. We were driving along and we had to get a Deseret. We wanted to hear the tennis shoes among the Nephites, and we decided to subscribe to Deseret Book. I turned to my wife and I said, "You realize this is going to cost me like $2,000 instead of $17 because we're going to forget about the subscription." But those things happen, right? And so those financial commitments, that actually determines the point of security. So as you think about how to manage money, you got to think about the supply side, but the demand side, your commitments, that's really the thing that you've got to be managing more. All right, so money governs your financial stress, and then it'll govern your luxury and philanthropy. As you think about how to manage it by financial commitments. Watch those commitments, because that's what will move your point of security. It's the difference between having to get a job that pays $50,000 and having to get a job that pays $500,000. And it's the depth of commitments that you've made and the debt that you've got. All right, so I think people over-rotate on money. I think they under-rotate on time. And here's what I mean. So the days of 40-hour jobs, I don't think they're there anymore. Right? Especially for BYU students. You're going to go out and you're going to get great jobs. And I think you got to just plan on realizing that you're going to work 40, 45, 50, 55 hours. And that's kind of what it's going to require to do the job, just to do the job. But the jobs that you're going to get are going to come attached with a lot of awesome extracurriculars. So the extracurriculars that I've run into, recruiting. Do you want to go to BYU and do some recruiting? Do you want to, at Polaris, it's, hey, do you want to go do some dealer rides? Do you want to go down to our big customer event in the dunes in Glamis? Do you want to spend some time leading the robotics team at the high school as part of what we do? But all these extracurricular activities, they can take a lot more time. So you might be 55 hours in your normal job, and then before you know it, if you're not careful, you end up 80 hours a week because you're doing a bunch of extracurriculars that you love. And you look at them and you say, you know what? It's awesome that I'm doing these things. And what I've observed when that happens is what I call happy, happy, happy snap, where you're working on your job and you're going along and you're saying, I love what I'm doing. I love everything that I'm doing. And then all of a sudden you wake up and you realize that you're not doing any service at church, and you realize that your relationships, and I mean all your relationships, are suffering. I mean, we're not talking about missing your kids' soccer games here. We're talking about missing entire school years. Right? You realize that you've just stressed everything, and that you don't have any hobbies, and you say, I got to get out of this, and snap, and you're gone. Happy, happy, happy snap, right? Time, it governs some big things in your life. If you're working it's a simple math equation. There's only so much time that you have. And if you spend it all working, because we know you have to sleep, you can find other ways. You can eat Soylent, like some of my friends do, and you can do that so that you don't have to spend time doing meals, but you know you're going to have to sleep at some point. And you know you're going to, if you spend all your time working, it leaves a small amount of time to do everything else. And if that equation gets way off, and it's easy to get way off, you'll end up with a snap. Now, having said that, there are seasons, there are times in your life where you're going to want to double down, and you're just going to realize that it's time to work. So we had a professor here that said, I think it's Norm Membro, who said, if you'll work like nobody else will work for 10 years, then you can live like nobody else can for the rest of your life. I don't know if that's fully true, but it was interesting for me to think about, right? And but he said, essentially what he's saying is there's a season where it's going to make a lot of sense to work like that. And there's a season where you want to spend that kind of time. And so I would encourage you, as you think about time, to realize that it's going to govern your relationships outside. It's going to govern your ability to do service, your ability to have hobbies. And it may also govern the velocity that you have in your career, how fast you're going to move, right? And the way that you manage it, first and foremost, is with personal boundaries. I went for my first 4 years at McKinsey, never working a Saturday or Sunday. I should say, I worked one Saturday or Sunday 4 years in. I don't know if I'd do it that way again, because it was extremely demanding during the work or during the week, and I had health issues because of it. But nonetheless, that's the boundary that I drew. And so you got to draw those personal boundaries and try to figure out how you're going to manage that. And then the second thing is just recognize that jobs, if you want to be an investment banker, if you want to go to McKinsey and Company, you're going to work a lot. If you want to be an executive, you're going to work a lot, because those jobs are very demanding. But also realize that it's for a season. You don't have to do it forever. So just be thoughtful about it. Now let's go to the third one, passion. So how important is it to each of you to do something awesome? Like to do something fun? All right, so we have some people out here. So it turns out I have a job that I think most people think is awesome. As I was going through thinking about, do I leave McKinsey, do I go to Polaris? Finally, one of my friends said, look, Musso, what red-blooded American man wouldn't want your job? Wouldn't want to go be president of Polaris? And I was like, that's a good point. Pretty good point. So for a living, my job is to make the line between wants and needs gray. Make people so that they want to look at these things and say, it's going to be a lot. I kind of need that thing. And if you're wondering, yes, you do need that in your life, because it's going to be a lot of fun, right? But here's the thing. So I get to work on really cool stuff, and it's fun to work on really cool stuff. It does not make the job perfect, but it does make me want to run to work a lot of days, right? And it's fun. It's fun to work on the passion, right? But that's kind of what it is. It's fun. The interesting thing about passion is I'm passionate about these machines, and the good news is I got a marketing team that does a great job of making really cool videos about it. But it's also kind of a choice, right? Some of it's the job choice you make. Some of it's just what you learn or what you decide that you're going to be excited about. And if you don't believe me, go find a life insurance salesman. Talk to him about life insurance. I mean, life insurance, that is eye-wateringly boring stuff, to me. But if you talk to a life insurance salesman, I mean, they live for it. Go find somebody who is an actuary. Talk to them about the actuarial tables. And they'll get excited about it. And you'll see that they can find excitement in whatever they do. I mean, I can tell you, there's been a lot of times in my career where it gets pretty dreary. And you look around and you find that excitement. And when you find that excitement, you realize that it's pretty cool. And so, I mean, you've got to think about the job choice. You've got to think about kind of your view, your perspective that you're taking on whatever it is that you're doing. And you'll realize that there's a lot of really interesting stuff out there, and that you can grow and you can learn and you can have a great time in almost any job. But some are inherently more exciting than others, right? So, as I think about passion, right, it governs really your fun. It governs your desire to run to work every day. And your attitude is by far the most important part around passion. So I've got friends in this room that that raise money for philanthropies. I've got others that do marketing for frozen foods. I've got others that do medical devices. And each one of them is passionate about what they do and really are making differences. And it's a lot of fun, right? But that attitude's the first thing. And the second thing, go find an industry that you like. There might be times where there's not anything available, but if there's something that you really like, point that way and figure out how to get there. There you go, frozen food. A little more attainable than a razor. You decide whether you think it deserves the same passion. It's pretty good frozen food. Razors are great. All right, next question I got for you. How many return missionaries do I have here? Oh, fantastic. Thank you for your service, first of all. Second, how many of you loved your mission? Wow, interesting. Remember all the money you made on your mission? Well, okay. Remember all the free time you had on your mission? No? What about all the fun? Maybe, a little bit. I would submit that the reason most of us loved our mission was because of the impact that we had and the personal growth that we had, right? The impact. So the impact, when I think about impact, that's what governs your fulfillment. Different than fun. Fulfillment is different than fun. It's also what governs your legacy as you think about impact. Think about the people. I mean, you've all heard stories about people that got baptized on your mission, and then later you get a letter from their kids or grandkids about all the people who've joined the church and all the impact that it had on their life. I've had one of those. That happened in one of the families that I baptized, and it's unbelievably fulfilling, and it's a wonderful legacy. People change their lives because of it. But it turns out that for most people, their fulfillment, their legacy, their impact actually happens at work. So look at some of these pictures that we have up here. Totally different ways that they impact the world. You start up in the top right corner, people who just created something from nothing and went and built something. Researchers here, the next three. You got great leaders. President Worthen, Meg Whitman, ran eBay, done some really great stuff. You get a couple down there that you may not recognize. These are my two PhD advisors. And so this is Tom Eager. He's the guy who called me when I was at BYU and said, hey, do you want to come to MIT? And then mentored me for the next 5 years. And this is Clay Christensen. Clay Christensen actually got to be pretty famous because of his business thinking and then his book, The Power of Everyday Missionaries. But it's really the personal impact that he had on me that I think about when I think about Clay's impact. So what's your impact going to be? I mean, you could bring something beautiful into the world. You could design a new product. I mean, you could create something from nothing. Or you could be the middle manager, toiling away in corporate America, helping people who just came out of BYU to get their bearing on their career and go forward. Or you could be a teacher, or you could be, there's so many things. But so much of impact and so much of your fulfillment depends on your perspective. And the reason that's important is because at some point in your life you're going to look back and you're going to grade yourself and you're going to say, how am I doing? Am I doing what I need to do with my career? And if you have the perspective around impact, then you'll realize this is where the world's different because I was here. And it's pretty cool to stand back and think about. But if you don't kind of watch and think about where your fulfillment's coming from and what the impact is, then you can end up in a completely different trap. And I'll talk about it a little bit later. But that trap is where you're grading yourself against somebody else's success. And remember, when you grade yourself, you're really comparing your weaknesses against somebody else's strengths. And that's a terrible place to be. And so you got to think hard about your impact and think about how you're going to make a difference. It governs legacy, it governs fulfillment, it governs meaning. It's very important, right? And you manage it by perspective, and you also manage it by trade-offs. There are trade-offs that you'll make in your career. I've got lots of friends who made trade-offs to go to be a professor, to be a teacher. And there's lots of associated trade-offs with that. I mean, there's lots of other benefits that come with it, but there's a lot of trade-offs. And you've got to be conscious of those trade-offs as you make them. All right, now let's talk about personal growth. So personal growth, I don't know if you guys have noticed, but the way that I drew this thing, it's a spider chart. And we'll map out different careers, and as you go through different choices, you'll kind of be able to look at where they are on each different dimension, different career choices you would have, and say, is that something I want to do or not, right? But personal growth is the only one that I know that allows them all to grow together, that makes it so that as you grow, you have better, not just bigger, but better, fundamentally better opportunities that work on kind of all dimensions, and they get better on all dimensions. And so, what does it mean to grow personally? Well, it starts with education, right? I mean, I am as passionate as it gets about education. So what you're doing here really, really matters. But what you're doing here, and particularly as an undergrad, is you're really learning the language. You're learning the language to go out into the workforce and see people who really know what they're doing, so that you can ask them the questions and learn from them and then be able to stand on their shoulders. Right? But it's just the beginning. It's really just the beginning. And so I had a few other things that I thought you ought to learn, right? So the first one's your craft. I would encourage you guys as engineers or as students in the engineering school to think of yourself as craftsmen, or as students in the HR school or wherever you are. Think about that table that a great craftsman makes and how good it's got to be. And think about what you're going to do as you go out to design something or to do whatever it is that you do, and say, how can I do something as great as that table? Can I learn that craft, right? So it starts there. And then the next one, what else are you going to learn? The first thing I think you need to learn is you need to learn by faith. You need to learn by faith. So I had a professor here, Steve Jones, Physics 101, last day of physics. He puts up all these quotes. And so you have quotes from Einstein and Marie Curie and all the early 20th century physicists. And then he puts up a bunch of quotes from the kind of mid-1800s that were literally almost verbatim the same quotes. And he said, who do you think these are from? I said, I don't know. And he said, Joseph Smith. And he said, here's the thing you got to remember, guys. You got to remember that God knows all these things. And we were in physics, right? And so he said, God knows physics, and God knows calculus, and God knows all these things because he created the world. And he created the world by mastering the laws. And so he knows those things, but most of what he's revealed to us so far has been around how to get along with each other. But if we're living in harmony with those things, then we have the right to ask him and have him teach us the other things. If I ever catch you guys another time, I'll tell you about how I finally cracked my PhD. One day when I was doing temple laundry and got called up to go help the temple president and got stuck in the bridal waiting room for a couple hours. But nonetheless, interesting story. You've got to learn how to balance demands. There's going to be demands on your time like you can't believe. You're busy now, it's going to get worse. It's only going to get worse until you retire. And even when I talk to people who retire, they say, still busy, but a lot of the busyness is a nap. But during that time, right? The next one, really important, you've got to learn to be able to tell your story and sell your ideas. Just think about it. The world's too complicated now. It's the world of purely individual contributors. It's kind of going away. I mean, there are some phenoms where it happens, and I don't want to discredit them. But really, you're going to have to be able to figure out how to get groups of people behind you, particularly if you're in corporate America, because the fight in corporate America is trying to figure out how you're going to get resources. And there's always other trade-offs with resources. And so you've got to figure out how you're going to be able to sell your story and get people behind you as you go, right? And then the last couple, building relationships. What's going to be your calling card? Why will people want to be close to you? Are you the person that they can confide in? Are you the person who's super knowledgeable? Are you the one who's just jolly and can kind of lift them up when they need to? I don't know, and you'll have to have all those skills. But for most of us, there's a spike. There's something in there that you're really good at, and it's worth thinking about. It's really worth thinking about how you do that. And then the last one, figure out which opportunities you're going to jump on. It's not as easy, and we probably could have a whole different talk on that one, but if I look at my most successful friends, the single factor that I see through all of them is a willingness to consider opportunities and often a willingness to jump and a willingness to change and to take some risk. All right, so personal growth. It governs progress, it governs opportunities, very clear on that stuff. You have to actively seek it. So one other story. So for my PhD, I looked at how to commercialize plastics. Awesome, right? I mean, what could be cooler than commercializing plastics? But the way that I did it is I went back through Modern Plastics magazine from like 1913, 1914 through 1999, and I looked at the growth of every plastic. And there was this period, and it's kind of a dark time in my life, but it was a 3-week period where I had to read through every one of those magazines and input all the data into the computer. And as you can imagine, I mean, I looked over and one time, and so I'm putting on all kinds of weight, trying to figure out why, and I looked over at my trash can, it's just full of Dr. Pepper. I mean, all the way out the top of Dr. Pepper cans. And I was just like, man, I'm trying to stay awake. And somewhere in there, I realized that I had an opportunity to learn how to use the 9 key, and that I'd get really good at using the 9 key. You guys even know what that thing is? So if you're in an old school keyboard, on the right-hand side of it, it's got all the numbers. And I learned how to type those things in without even looking at them. And I was so proud of myself, but it was something to grow on because I was looking for something that I needed to feel like I was growing instead of doing my mindless translation from Modern Plastics magazine into Microsoft Excel. That wasn't the most useful skill, but it was fulfilling. And it helped this thing to be a little bit more fulfilling. And if you'll always be actively seeking it, I think you'll find other things to be fulfilling as well. All right, so the last one, X factor. I couldn't come up with a name for it. I didn't know what to call it, but really what I'm talking about here is personal priorities. Personal priorities, when you come up to a job decision or a career decision, often swamp everything else. And what I mean by that is, well, actually, let me give you some examples. So examples of the types of priorities that people that I hear about. One, the biggest one's got to be location, right? I need to be here because my son's a junior in high school and I can't leave, or I need to be here because my father's sick, or I need to be here because of my church calling or whatever it is, right? So that's one. Prestige is another one. What a prestigious opportunity, I want to do that. Let's see, willingness to take risk. And certain situations make it so you can't take any risk. Sometimes particular financial situations might bring it back in there. But they're all things that you got to think about. And these things kind of swamp everything else. Now here's the trick with an X factor though. If you go through a string of them, like one after the other, and optimize around X factors your entire career, you're going to optimize around those X factors, and you're going to find yourself in a different place than somebody who didn't. And that place is not necessarily worse, but it's going to be different, right? I was talking to a guy who, clearly optimized around raising his kids. And he told me that here's the words he used. He said, my own personal hell is that I was blessed with an incredible amount of talent, and I squandered it in my career. I'm not rich. I'm kind of sitting on retirement. I'm not rich. Haven't made that much impact in the world. But then as we talked a little bit more, we realized that his children were amazing. They'd done amazing things. And we talked and said, well, what were you optimizing for? Let's talk about the decisions that you had. And it was clear as he went back through them that he had decided around those children. And that was his thing. But then he was grading himself against the wrong criteria. Right? You've got to grade yourself against the criteria that you do. And so if you go down an X factor path, that's completely fine. It may be your whole life, right? But recognize that you need to grade yourself against that. And the other thing I would tell you is that X factors, sometimes they're pretty easy to fall into. And sometimes you got to be a little critical of it. Like, do I really need to be here? Do I really need to be in this location, or am I willing to take a risk? And often, if you'll take that question, you'll realize that maybe I don't. And maybe there's a whole other set of opportunities that'll come up. But the problem is, with these things, often you'll shut down the opportunity before you ever even ask Heavenly Father, right? And so you want to just at least think them through and make sure that they're going. So X factors, they really do govern your priorities as you go, right? You manage them by being aware of them, being aware of why you're making the decision, and manage them by seasons. Just think about them in seasons. So those are the 6 dimensions that I think you ought to be thinking about as you study them out. All right, so here's kind of what you can do with our little chart. This is me at MIT. Right, this is what it looked like. So I was working on commercializing plastics. What is cooler than working on commercializing plastics, except selling razors to anybody? Very passionate, growing like a weed. I mean, I grew so much there. I mean, it just completely changed my career. Didn't have any money, didn't have too much time, and frankly, didn't make a whole lot of impact during that time, except during church. Here's the McKinsey. This is kind of my senior partner. There were times when it was different, but when I left as a senior partner, pretty good on money, working on some pretty neat things, felt like I was changing some industries. No time. I got 5 kids. I had no time during that time, and I kind of got to a point where I wasn't growing the way that I needed to grow. And so it was kind of time to leave because of where I was. So I'm out of time, but here's my message. BYU students, you guys are going to do amazing things. There's just no question. You're going to do amazing things, right? But I'd love for you to think as you go into your career about a few things, right? On the answer, I told you there was one unique answer to the question. It's you. You own your career. Nobody else does. And just know that. And keep that in your mind, right? You're going to make 10, 12, 15, something like that, really pivotal decisions as you go through your career. Remember to ask Heavenly Father about them. Always remember to ask Heavenly Father about them. But study them out. And I think you ought to study them out against the 6 dimensions that we've laid out here, right? And then it's just such a big point. Just make sure that as you go through and you grade kind of how you're succeeding, that you're grading yourself on your optimization criteria. So I'm out of time, but one last point. I'm pulling for you. I think every alum in this room is pulling for you. One of my mentors at BYU, Ida Smith, she sat me down one time and she said, look, I was talking to her, I had a half scholarship, which meant all the difference for me. And she said, look, I don't know who gave that. I don't know who paid for that half scholarship. I don't know where it came from. You're never going to know either, and you're never going to be able to pay them back. But what a blessing that you've been given. And the only thing you can do is do everything you can with it going forward. And just go do great things. Because if you do great things, then whoever paid for your scholarship or whoever paved the way before here for you to go, they'll be proud of you, and that'll be enough for them. And you'll understand as you become alumni that you'll have a chance to do the same thing for people going forward. But you're going to do great things, and I can't wait to see how you do it. So thank you for your time, and thank you, Dean Jensen, for the special honor to be able to speak with you. Thanks, guys.